You may be seated. If you have your Bibles, turn me to Nehemiah chapter 2. We're in a series. This is the 8th week of this series, and in this series of problems and promises, we've been walking through the Word. And as we've been walking through the Word, we have gone from the 12 spies. We've worked our way all the way back to the New Testament, the story of Jesus, then all the way to work back to another story, right? Because it's so easy that we could have pulled stories of how many people in the Bible saw problems and didn't walk in promises. It was actually a little bit tougher for me to say, who's the one we'll find that heard the promise through the problem? And so we fell on Nehemiah. And so we are now in the 3rd week of Nehemiah on this 8-week series of problems and promises. This is the quick rundown of the problem in the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah worked for the king. He saw his friends in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3. He asked his brothers, how are things back in Jerusalem with God's people? And they said to me, chapter 1, verse 3, the remnant there in the providence who had survived the exiles is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broke down and the gates are destroyed with fire. Everybody say problem. Say problem. Every one of us have had problems. It's this very truth that he saw the problem, he heard the problem, his heart broke, and he began to press in and pray. And he prayed the promise. And it's chapter 1, verse 9. Nehemiah says, but you, God, you're in the work, you're in our midst, you're doing a work. But if you, God's people, turn to me, God, and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you are cast out of the farthest parts of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. He saw the problem. He remembered the promise that you said, yeah, we will reap what we sow. There is sin. Sin brings problems. We are in a problem because of sin. But I believe your promise is that you'll still draw us back in. From the beginning of what this story has been from Exodus, that they were drawn out to be drawn in. They were drawn out of Egypt, but to be drawn into His presence. And the problem was sin. And then he with grace and mercy, continued to walk them and walk them and walk them and walk them. But it brought them back to this place. But because of sin, a problem. But he was clinging to the promise. So he clings to the promise, and in the promise, he begins to pray. He prayed for 4 months. He prayed, he fasted, and he planned for 4 months. And this is how we know that he prayed and planned, not just because he said it. It's because the king all of a sudden said, what do you need, Nehemiah? What's going on? And we know that quick, Nehemiah had the plan. He was ready, he was prepared, and he spoke out everything he needed. And pretty much the king gave him a blank check. Because of God's grace, God working through the midst, this is how the story's picked up now, this week. So by God's grace, Nehemiah is now walking to Jerusalem. He's leaving with the king's permission, with the king's authority, with the king's horse, with the king's house to stay in, with the king's lumber to build the gates, with the king's captains, with the king's army, and the horses. Go rebuild the walls, Nehemiah. God gave him grace and favor and said, work through the promise. All right, Nehemiah chapter 2. This is where we pick up this week. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11. So I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do in Jerusalem. Nor was there any animal with me except the one which I rode. And I went out by night through the valley gate, to the serpent well, the refuse gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates had been burned with fire. Then I went to the fountain gate, to the king's pool. But there was no room for the animal to go under the pass. So I went up by the night in the valley and viewed the wall. And I turned back and entered the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials didn't know where I'd gone. All right, let's pick this up right here where it's at. Nehemiah didn't just pull up. It said for 3 days he just waited, prayed, surveyed. He didn't just pull up and go, hey guys, I'm here to rebuild. Could you imagine though how amazing it would have been to walk in with the entourage of the king's army, with the king's lumber, to walk up and be like, you're welcome. I'm the hero of the story. You're welcome. If you've not been a part of this series, we have been watching and seeing that God does a work in people who are not worthy, who are not enough. He does a work, but it's not for us to be known, but for Him to be known. Nehemiah comes in, surveys, and goes, how can this be done? How is it they see me pull up that I'm not the hero of the story? He begins to survey. And he does something really important, and I want you to get this. He grabs 3 men close to him and says, come walk with me. Come walk with me and let's assess. Let's be completely honest with what's actually happening. Let's go look, be honest, and talk about what the damage has done for our family. What if a man was to grab a couple guys that he trusted? Now, moving from the story of Nehemiah, put it in our world today. What if a man was to grab somebody that he trusted and loved and said, can I trust you? Can I be honest with you? Can I, for a few moments, just assess what the enemy has done in my life, the brokenness? Can I just for a few moments understand and know that the work that is being done here is bad? To the point that he said he got to one place in the wall that his horse couldn't get around it. He got stuck and he was literally like, I don't know what to do. It's so in dismay. It's so broken down and ruined. I don't believe it can be rebuilt, some would think. What if a man was honest enough to go, the enemy's done a number with our family. The enemy has tore down some walls and our family's been exposed to the enemy. All right. This word viewed, I was trying to make sure that you heard me read the word viewed. I didn't know that. I've preached Nehemiah, I've taught this before, but I didn't know that in this part of Nehemiah, this word viewed means so much more. The word view, the actual definition in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 13 and 15, the word view actually means, it's a medical term, and it says that it's described as probing a wound to see the extent of how bad it is. It's actually to, as a doctor would look at a wound to go, how bad is this? Looking at the damage of rebuilding not just a wall for our family, but looking at the wounds that it caused. Proverbs says it like this: whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. If we take the story of Nehemiah and overlay it onto our life spiritually, I want you to see this truth. That he had to first come in and assess, actually, how bad is the problem in my life? What do the spiritual walls look like in my life? It begins with honesty. It begins with confession. It begins with explaining not only am I not where I need to be spiritually, I now have wounds. I need to be open and honest and be like a city that's exposed with no walls. So he assessed the damage. The damage that's done to the enemy, by the way, by the enemy, has caused fear in a group of people. Again, we're overlaying this in our life. Has there not been problems in your life? Has the enemy not done damage in your life? Has it not produced fear in your life? We've spoke so many times about this, is that fear paralyzes us. Fear grips us. So this wound, this hurt from the enemy, these walls that are torn down has caused fear, and the broken walls means insecurity in our lives. And what the plan of the enemy is that we would walk with insecurities and fear. And the truth and the honesty of the big deal of what this is that it would have been easy for Nehemiah to go, but can we not talk about how bad it is? Let's focus on what's good in our life. Let's talk about all the good things. Listen, usually God does this because I don't say a sense of humor, but He does it because we need it. Usually in a marriage, usually in a relationship, you have one person who's the more negative and one who tries to be the positive, I hope. And there's a bend for somebody in this room that when we assess, what we are bent to do is assess, these are all the things that are wrong. And for somebody else, by the way, don't look at your spouse. Some people are looking around, look right at me. Look right at me. Somebody's just like, don't do that. Not today. Don't. It's a good Sunday. Don't ruin a day. Some people have a bend to go, when I think and assess, I'm going to think of all the things that are wrong. There are some people, they cannot hardly do life without being critical of everything. That they break down even the good that you're trying to do. They break it down. But on the other side, there are some people that are like, what are you talking about? I mean, the walls are tore down and they're just in shambles like, no, it's a beautiful day. I don't see walls. Broke down. No, we're good. Y'all are grinning because you know people like that too. There has to be a balance. There's going to have to be a balance of walking in with the promise of God of hope, but also walking in the truth of this has to be assessed. We can't begin to know the extent of the work to be done until we actually look at the damage. Look at actually what has the enemy done. And I'm going to overlay this in our life today. I need us to, with hope that God can, with positive, truly assess our life spiritually. Assess our family. To be able to expose what has the enemy done. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Be very careful not to just walk in with the us for no more. Don't walk in and go, I'm going to assess my family, my wife, my kids, and I'm going to assess me. Stop. This is a 100-year-old problem, y'all. This didn't happen with one generation. They are where they are because the generations before them walked with fear and insecurity. They are where they are because of the brokenness in their parents, grandparents' life. Someone found it very safe to just walk where we walk, stay where it is. I mean, think about it. 100-year-old problem. Let's just figure out how to survive in the brokenness. Does that speak to somebody? Like, I know that the things are broken. Let's just figure out how to make it. Instead of going, what if we rebuild the right way? Rather than being in survival mode. When Nehemiah walks up and he assesses it, I don't know what's going through his mind, but as I'm studying, thinking this, I'm thinking that I'd look into this and go, how have they lived like this for so long? How have they lived this long in fear and insecurities? How is it that the enemy has had access in and out with no borders, with no breaking down, no protection? The enemy has just been walking in and out of these families' lives however he wants and please. That in this very truth, he's going to have to assess, and I'm going to ask you to assess, be honest about your own family. And when I say family, your parents, your brothers, your sisters. To be able to assess and look and know that this very truth of where we sit today is not because you just woke up one day and was like, uh-oh, problem. Nope. It has been a cycle of generations for so many of us that we find ourselves in survival mode. Nehemiah looks and goes, I can't believe they've been in survival mode this long. Remember the whole part of the story. The whole series is problems and promises. We have to begin with assessing the problem. We have to look and see and understand. And if we're not careful, the very thing that we've been leading up to this is that people will get to this place and they will assess it, they will see the problem, and when they see the problem, they go, this is a huge problem. Remember the saying that we're talking about. Do you really believe that your problems are so big it makes God's promises small? But if we're not careful, when we look, because some of y'all, when I said, I don't want you to look at the us four no more, I don't want you to look at your family, look at your mom, look at your dad, look at your relatives, look at your aunt, I want you to look and see. Some of y'all are like, now you're meddling. Like, whoa, stop. No. For some of us, when we really look at that, we actually see, oh, this thing's huge. This is a big problem. This has been problem for 100 years problem kind of thing. This is a cycle of defeat from generation to generation of just survival mode. Let's figure it out. Listen, do not let in the assessment of the problem find us in this place that we feel weak and insignificant. If you've been a part of the series for 8 weeks, you know that this is the place the enemy wants to have us. Go back to the few stories we talked about. With every one of the stories, with the 12 spies, 10 of them saw problems and said, weak, insignificant, we're like grasshoppers in the sight of giants. No way we can do this. Do not assess this and let fear grip. When you truly assess the reality of your family, to assess the reality of parents, of grandparents, of 100 years before me, how have I got here? What caused me to be this way? What has put a bend in me like this? What is the generational bondage that's on my family's life? What does this look like? Assess it. Be honest, but believe this truth. You're probably going to feel like a grasshopper inside of this. How can I fix a 100-year problem? By the way, I didn't start the problem. How can I be the one that fix it? Stop. Do you believe all things are possible with God? Do you believe that in the Word? Do you believe He makes all things new? Do you truly believe that God takes broken people and He uses them to fulfill His perfect plan? I wrote something down this week that has been just on repeat in my heart this week. Our family's dysfunction is not greater than God's decree. I want to say that again. Our family, not just to us four no more, what has brought us from the 100 generations, what brought us here? Our family's dysfunction is not greater than God's decree. The church's 100-year problem, 200-year problem, capital C church, not Eastside, the capital C church is dysfunction at best in areas. Listen to me. Our dysfunction is not greater than God's decree. To understand and know that we assess our families and the walls and the spiritual walls, assess the church, assess the spiritual walls and go, dysfunction, brokenness, but believe in the promise that God has never failed us yet. That the beautiful part of Nehemiah writing, he's writing and looking going, this is, how in the world? But all of a sudden, he calls a meeting. Nehemiah calls a meeting. Pull down to verse 17. He assessed it with some men in private. He was honest with them and said, can I be honest and tell you, I'm this way and I've been this way a long time. I have walked in this situation because my father walked in this situation. He was honest with some men. They kept it private and they said, now let's have a meeting. I'm not Nehemiah, but I'd love to call a meeting today. I couldn't say it any better than what Nehemiah did when he called the meeting of the people. Verse 17, he said, then I said to them, you see the distress that everybody say we. You see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us, everybody say us, build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God which has been good upon me, and also of the king's word that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this great work. He called a meeting and he said, can we talk? Can we be honest? There's a problem. There's a problem, and it begins with the enemy. I appreciate how he made the enemy. And I appreciate that he said, we have a common problem. We have an enemy. I appreciate that he did not go, y'all are the enemy. Y'all are the problem. It's not easy for us to point fingers and go, well, we're here because of, and remember, go back to when you assess it. It will be easy to go, well, it's because my dad was the way he was, my mom was the way he was, their parents were the way they were. And that's what, it would be easy to go, well, we sit here today because of this. Stop. Assess all that, bring it to this place, and be honest and go, but the common thing has not been the dysfunction in all of our families being dysfunction. The common thing is the enemy has caused dysfunction. The enemy is the enemy. And he said, and we have a common enemy. Our husband, our wives, our family, that's not the enemy. Can I tell you something? Most of the time we spend our time fighting the ones that we should be in common ground going, that's the enemy. But the enemy has this great thing of twisting it up and making it that we're fighting amongst ourselves and that the enemy is just laughing going, I win. They're not fighting me because they're fighting each other. Their focus is pointing at each other. Your spouse and your children are not your enemy. It would be easy for you to look at this church and go, well, because the church is stop, 100-year problem. It would be easy for us to go, what? Stop. The common problem is the enemy. We in our families have a common problem. And I mean every capital C church, there is a common problem. It is the enemy. And I love how he started the meeting. The job hasn't even started yet. He hasn't even told them the vision and the plan. This was the original vision and the plan. We all are dysfunctional, but we are not each other's enemy. The church is dysfunctional. We have been in survival mode. It is not the problem. The enemy is the problem. And I'm so grateful that he focuses on this truth, that he says, What really happened is the enemy caused disunity. He broke the unity, then he broke the walls. I won't say this again. He broke the unity, and then he broke the walls. God has been longing to draw us out, to draw us in, that we do walk unified and following Him in His presence. And then all of a sudden, the enemy does what the enemy does. And when he creeps in and he comes in, it makes it that we're not now fighting the main thing we should be fighting. Nehemiah says, this is the work. And I appreciate how he said, we, us, together. You know how he says? And we will with this common enemy fight the common enemy, and we will rebuild. I appreciate, I more than anybody feel the weight of this. When Nehemiah came in, he would have came in with the cavalry, with the king's lumber, with the king's army, with the king's stuff going, I'm here, guys, here to save the day. Going to fix all these families and the walls. Listen to me. He said, you, we, us, we will rebuild. I'm not here to rebuild the walls alone, by myself. I'm here to lead the charge of you building the walls. We'll see later in it that he put them on section of the wall and said, that family, that family, that family, that family. Put the families in the place. And as you, as individual families, begin to build, it builds the greater wall around the church. I appreciate that Nehemiah pulled up with the horse and the cavalry and said, oh, by the way, you ready to work? For far too long, people have looked to the church and the pastor and some staff to do a work. And by the way, I will fail you every time. Can't build your walls. I will fail you every time thinking that I'm going to swoop in and be the hero of this church because I'm the pastor. What? No. I said, I would love to be Nehemiah and say it the way he said it as a body. Hey guys, we all have a common enemy, and we all have to bind together to work first in our homes. And as we unify the walls of our homes spiritually, all of a sudden, shoulder to shoulder, we build a church that's unified in the walls. Now, this thing is a work, though. We have a work. That's a 4-letter word for some people. To know that we live in a world where some would say this is the laziest generation we've ever seen. Some of y'all might say this is the laziest generation we've ever seen. There's some lazy people that don't want to work. I'm not even wanting to get into that. Because you want to know what? I'm going to say on the other side, yeah, I've seen a lot of lazy people right now. Can I tell you something? But I've also seen a generation that I would put them up against any generation that when you put them to the task, they want to work. They want to build. But everybody, no matter where you land on this, look at me. It is work. It is work. This is not something that you show up on Sunday and be like, preach it again next week, preacher. Sing it again next week. No, it is work. He calls the meeting and goes, we have a common enemy, but we have a common work to do. This is work. It is going to be tough. It's going to be difficult, but this is work. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 18. Listen to how he says, though, how he addresses it. Not only is this going to be work, God is working. Verse 18, and I told them of the hand of my God which had been upon me, and also the king's word that he had spoken to me. And that's when they said, let's arise. Let us arise up and build. And they set their hands to this good work. I know that this is a story of Nehemiah. I know this is a story that happened so many years ago, and I'm overlaying it into us. But can you believe that the Holy Spirit is aligning some things up in a lot of our lives? Nehemiah said this in the called meeting. Hey guys, God's doing something really special, like super special. God is doing a work that no man gets credit for. Do you really want to know what Nehemiah said? It's the same thing I'd say to you. God's doing something really special. Don't miss out. Be a part of the plan. We've been fasting. We've been praying. We've been planning. God is doing something special. And there's a couple of them like looking at the walls that look tore down. They're looking at the walls being like, He is? Listen how Nehemiah started. He goes, God's doing something special. God took King Artaxerxes, a wicked king. He took his heart and He turned it. A sinful, disgusting, broken heart, hardened heart. And He turned it. And God turned his heart and used him to supply the provision for the vision. Do you imagine what work that does when you pretty much tell the testimony story? Listen, I know that we don't do testimony services anymore. I know it's a hard thing to us to be like, does somebody want to testify? Because if we're not careful, it gets a little out of hand and people talk about their bunion that's feeling a lot better now. And I just want to thank God for my cat Mimi is like, what? Stop. Wait a minute. I know we don't do testimony service like we used to, but there is something beautiful when you testify in the truth of what God is doing. Can I do it in this church for a minute? Hey guys, I know I'm not Nehemiah, but can I tell you something? God is doing something special in our church right now. Don't miss out. Hey guys, God is taking people who at one point their heart seemed hardened and hard, and He's turning it back towards Him. God is taking people that would look back and go, like, he couldn't use King Artaxerxes. There's no way He could use him. God is taking the people that doesn't seem like would be the right ones to carry His perfect plan. Broken, imperfect people. And He's going, look at what I'm doing. Can I testify to somebody? God is doing something special in the church. Do not miss out. And now I'm not talking about the story of Nehemiah. I'm talking about this church right here. God is doing something special in the church. He's taking men's heart and He's turning them. He's taking their face and He's saying, look at me. He's taking them and revealing the truth and the awe of who He is. And I, like Nehemiah, would say to you, don't miss out. God is at work in our midst. He says, God is working certainly, but He makes this very clear. And it's not just about the brick and the mortar of the wall. Right? If we're going to be really honest about the story, it's, oh dear God, let us understand and know that this is not about brick and mortar, sticks and bricks. This is about the greater spiritual wall that you're building. He's doing it right now. You believe this or not, but you've been here long enough to hear me say this. I'm truly not trying to grow a church. I'm trying to grow people. This is not about the sticks and bricks. This is not about a building. It's about the spiritual walls of your house. I got to tell you that he rallies them. He has a meeting. He says, look at what God's doing. Look at how the king's brought all this. Look, I've got the entourage. Look, guys. Look, God is at work. Don't miss out. That story would end really well and they'd live happily ever after. I'm grateful that's not how the story goes because that's not how it's going in my life. That as he rallies the troops, as he says, God is working, let's do this, and he sets that task, this is what we're doing, all of a sudden, the real work began, the spiritual work. Real life. Remember, this is about problems and promises. How many of you have assessed your life at some point? How many of you got to a place and go, you know what, I'm not walking in His promises? Some of the walls are torn down. The enemy has come into my life. He has entry and exit. There's doors that are open I need boarded up. There are ways that he's coming. You know what? I need to do such work. And as we start taking the steps forward, all of a sudden you will see the great work is in the spiritual work. Another problem comes up. Turn me to verse 19. Nehemiah, chapter 2, verse 19. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Amorite official, and Geshem, Arab, heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? All right. Did you just see the rhythm of what happened? This is what happened. Guys, God's doing something special. Get in now. Don't miss out. He's turning hearts. He is doing a work. Don't miss it. Don't miss it. And all of a sudden they're like, I'm in. I'm in. And as they take the first step in, all of a sudden, the next verse said, and the enemy, Sanballat and Tobiah, Amariah, the Horonite, and for the guy from Geshem, It just showed up. You know what happened? Immediately the next verse, opposition. Immediately the next verse, pushback. Notice when the opposition came. I want you to see this. Not at the heart stage of Nehemiah. Not when Nehemiah had a burden in his heart and he was like, you know what, I'm burdened about some things. Not when the vision stage began to take place that he was like, you know what, I see a vision of what could take place. Not at the prayer stage. Not at the planning stage. But when the progress was soon to begin and they took the first steps forward to what God has for their life, for them to rebuild the spiritual walls, the enemy immediately, next verse, steps in. I'm just going to ask a question. Has anybody ever seen that this is normal, spiritual life in your life? That you have said, I'm stepping into what God has for me, and immediately meet opposition of the enemy. If you were not a part of the marriage retreat, you weren't able to see some of the things that we were in and a part of, but leading up to it, we have a team that meets. And this year, we had to be really intentional to say, hey, we don't do a job well enough on this part. Let's start praying and fasting now, months in advance. Yes, for the marriage retreat, but for you, the ones who are going to step forward and minister. We sat in a living room and we said, be prepared. We have the vision, we have the plan, we're stepping forward. Without getting all the details, the month, the weeks before the marriage retreat, days before the marriage retreat, the day before the marriage retreat. I'm not giving you details. All hell broke out to everybody who was going to do any leading. Literally, on their minds, on their body, all hell broke loose. And it was the thing that I'm grateful for those in wisdom above me that said, hey, I appreciate that you've planned, you got a vision, we got what we're doing. But I'm grateful that somebody that lived a little bit longer than I have said, there's one consistent thing that we all know is going to take place, opposition. The enemy is going to come in, and as the enemy did, critique everything that's done. And it's going to start with your mind first. That you feel like a small grasshopper, that you don't have it. You can't do it. That all of a sudden, critiquing, all of a sudden what happens right here with them is, did you read what it said? And it said, what is this thing that you've done? Despise it. Like immediately breaking down before they even laid a hand on them spiritually. Right here. Having them question what the work is. There's one common thing that we all know. We have the same enemy. Nehemiah said that. But there's one thing that I can tell you in the promises of God. There is also this promise that the enemy will always come after those that are moving forward. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Keep your eye open. Because your adversary, the devil, your spouse is not the adversary. We are not the adversary. The enemy prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking who may devour. So there's something you can use in study. It's called the law of proportion. But actually, what's really fun is you can take the law of proportion in your own life. Is go back and look at in the proportion of the times that I've tried to do something, what was the opposition, right? When you read the Bible, the law of proportion in other ways you can do it. You can read it and go, okay, this is what this is what this is, and just proportionally see kind of pros con list of what it is. I did it on this one. I want you to see this. When Nehemiah's passion is revealed, we get one verse on the passion, right? We get a glimpse in of the passion of Nehemiah, one verse. When Nehemiah's prayer is exposed, we get 6 verses on what that is. When Nehemiah's plan is exposed, we get 8 verses on it. When Nehemiah's preparation of what he did, we get 11 verses on that. But when Nehemiah is persecuted, we get 3 straight chapters of persecution, opposition from hell. Can somebody say the law of proportion has been that in your life? That all of a sudden it's this glimpse of, oh yeah, look at what God, look at this. I guess I'm going to take a step forward. Wham, 3 chapters of, I feel like I've been in this warfare longer than I've walked in the free. Like, oh my goodness. The law of proportion is, there is a battle that is set right now, and I feel like this is never going to end. Verse 19 comes because of verse 18. Verse 19 is the verse we just read, and the enemy came after them. That verse was because of the verse before it, because they set their hands to do good work. They set their hands to do good work. The problem is that today, as we preach this, declare this, we call for men to right here in your life, women, right here in your life, start right here assessing your heart, assessing your family, assessing the greater family. And then when we say, dear God, bless the works of my hand, let's go. Just know the enemy hates it. One of the greatest truths my pastor, who is my dad, taught me a long time ago, please take heart in hell. This part of hell that's coming against you, take heart in it. You know why? Because he didn't mess with you when you weren't doing anything. He didn't mess with you when you were just talking about it. It was when you start putting feet to faith. The enemy goes, oh no. Take heart that what you are doing, it's worth it. We've assessed the problem, but I love that when Nehemiah all of a sudden goes, wait, what? We haven't even started yet, and the enemy's jumped right in. The enemy is hindering. The enemy is immediately critiquing a work. We're not even there yet. Go to verse 20. Listen to the promise. And so I answered them and I said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. This is powerful. The enemy says what the enemy says he's going to do, and I love how Nehemiah responded to the enemy. You know what he said? God is not on your side, he's on my side. He didn't show up and go, there's opposition, and he pulls himself up by the bootstraps and goes, let me show you how I can do this. Let me show you the work that I can do. I'm going to work harder. Do you know what Nehemiah says? If there's anything that prospers out of this, it's because of God. If my family advances in the spiritual walls and we begin to grow spiritually, it's not because I pulled myself up by the bootstraps and I led really well as a husband, as a father. What? Come on, that's a joke. It's because God prospered anything. The work of these hands have brought destruction. Anybody know that to be true? When I put my hands to it, I always mess something up. Because you know what? The heart of who I am is wicked, sinful. That when I realize I'm not enough, Nehemiah realized I'm not enough to build the walls. It will be God who does the work. It will be the work of God. And I love how he pressed in. He goes, and by the way, you have no say-so here. God is for us. You're not for us. So if this is opposition, what are you doing? You don't even get a voice in this. What are you doing? You have no heritage in this. These walls are not for you. They're for God's people. This work is for what God wants. I am so grateful that Nehemiah spoke this truth. I mentioned already last week was the marriage retreat. If you didn't get to go, if you weren't a part of it, let me just tell you what the theme was. The theme was this: God is enough. Do you know what the Lord had laid on our heart leading 3 months before we got there to this is the theme, this is where we're at? It's been a setup. Which husband has led their house so well that now all is well because you did it so well? Which husband's done that? Which mom is so amazing? What wife is so amazing that now your house is Betty Crocker's put in place exactly the way it's supposed to be because you're amazing? The theme was this: God has called you to be the perfect husband and the perfect wife. It's a setup for failure. It's a setup for failure. But it's this thing that the quicker we realize, I can't be the husband God called me to be. I can't be the father God's called me to be. Quicker realize, I can't be the wife. I can't be the mom that God's called me to be. I can't do this on my own. Something happens when the enemy comes in. As the enemy comes in, he goes, you're not enough. You go, I know. Steer right into it. You go, I know I'm not, but my God's enough. I'm not enough, but that's what makes me cling to the cross the way I do. It's what makes me, not because I had a good week this week that I go, put it on cruise, let's do this. You'll find yourself on your face failed. There is not a cruise button on this thing. There's not a thing, I think we got it figured out as men. I think we got it figured out as moms. No, we don't. What we have figured out is there is a common enemy. What we've figured out is that we are not victims of this. We are the villains of the story. He is the hero. What we have found out is that we are not enough. He is. And that's why this month's scripture, that's why the theme, the scripture for the marriage retreat, and what I'm going to say to you today, that's why when God told Joshua, be strong and courageous. Not do better, not try harder, not, come on man, I gave you the ability and the talent. Nope. Be strong and courageous that I am your God. Be strong and courageous that I have gone before you. Be strong and courageous. Have I not walked with Moses? I will walk with you. Be strong and courageous. I have been God from the beginning. I'm the God of the end. Be strong and courageous that I'm enough. And quickly we find in the story of Joshua is that immediately his first be strong and courageous is, oh my Lord, there's a huge wall. In praying and planning, it's been hard for me not to parallel these two things. Be strong and courageous. If there seems like there's walls in your family that's been built up, we know the God that can tear down walls. Joshua didn't tear down the wall, did he? Be strong and courageous. I will do the work. Be strong and courageous and walk in the truth of who I am. There are those here in this room that have walls around your family, walls in your marriage. The God we serve tears down walls. And the God we serve, He builds the walls that He's called us to build. There is this place of tearing down, the deconstruction of what was and what is and what the enemy has done. And there is this beautiful place that God calls us to go, I'm now asking you to set your hands to this great work. Here's how we're going to end today. I'm going to ask for Luke to come around. We're going to end with this truth. God is doing something special in our church. Please do not miss it. I'm not going to tell the testimonies of the people. That's for them to tell. But the testimonies of what God is doing in the families of this church, no one gets credit but God. No one. That I would speak to you, be strong and courageous. God is at work and He's doing His part. But what He's called the men and women to do is to first assess. That's what I want to ask you to do in just a moment. Luke's going to play. I want to call you to this place of going, God, help me assess. How do you don't get here overnight. This dysfunction is years. Years that rolled into my upbringing, that rolled into their upbringing, that rolled into... This seems so much greater than I can imagine. But until you assess what has caused you to come to this place right now, assess it. And here's what I'm going to truly ask. There is something that's truthful of His Word. When we confess the brokenness, the sins, when we confess one to another so that we can be healed. What the enemy would love for us to do is keep the broken walls of our life spiritually hid and just be in survival mode, figure out how to make it work, make it last. I think everybody in this room knows what I mean when I say just you're in survival mode. But the enemy's coming in and out, in and out, in and out. I would challenge you to assess, and I'd challenge you to find somebody really close to you and go, can I be honest? There's a lot of work ahead. Can I be honest? Look at this part of the wall. Horse couldn't even get through it. It looks like it's unrepairable. God makes all things new. What's beautiful is when the men that were with him were then able to hear the story of, this is going to happen, guys, because God will prosper this. God will do the work. I'm going to ask you to assess it. I'm going to ask you at some point to be honest with somebody. Then I'm going to ask you to whatever it looks like for you to commit. I don't know what it looked like that day. All I know is that they said, may we rise up and may we build the walls with our hands. And they set their hands to do work. Did you hear what I said? Work. It is work spiritually to tear down, to rebuild. Father, for the next few moments, may this be the house of prayer. If we're not careful, we make this the house of preaching and the house of singing, but you said, may my house be the house of prayer. Your word's gone forth. I do believe that you are calling families to assess the reality of what has brought us here in dysfunction. It didn't happen overnight. It is years of dysfunction. What's caused me to continue to trip up in this area? It's years of a broken wall where the enemy can just come in and out of the gate, my eye gate. The enemy has tore down some truths in our life. We don't have the gate of your promise. We focus on problems. Church, for the next moment, will you just press in and assess? There is beauty in your honesty. There is healing in truth. The enemy is a liar. There's not a family here that can't quickly find a problem. There's not a family here that can't quickly realize, oh man, the enemy has tore down walls. Not a family here that can't find destruction from the enemy, dysfunction from the enemy. I'm going to ask you for just a moment, would you cling to a promise? Sure, we assess, but there is hope in His promise. Whatever problem, dysfunction, brokenness that you've just identified and assessed, would you for a moment now focus on a promise that's from God? If you can't think of one, we just read it in Nehemiah. You will prosper. You will help rebuild. You are in our midst working a great work. I declare it over my family. I declare your promises over this church. I declare that you are the one that's prospering families. You are the one doing a work. It's by grace. It's by your mercy, by your patience and your long suffering. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to stand. These altars are open for anybody. If you have any need, anything, we'd love to pray with you. Here's what I know. I now want to ask, would you commit the commitment that we just read about? Whatever it looks like for you, your family, if you want to grab a hold of your family that's next to you, grab a hold of their hand. It represents something bigger than you, I know. But here's what I'm going to ask you to do. To commit your hands to this great work. To commit your hands to this great work. It will be work. There is an enemy who will hate you moving forward. But I'm going to ask you, whatever it looks like for you to press in and go, take my hands, God, for this work. Take my hands for I know that this is greater than me. It was a 100-year thing, but what I'm doing is a 100-year thing. It's greater than me. It's my great-great-grandchildren. It's me knowing that I'm building walls that I may never even see this part of my family walk in. Whatever it looks like for you, church, just press in right now. Press in.